To the Great Basin seasonal outlook for November through February. In October, the first 3 weeks of October were very dry and warm across the Great Basin, with well above normal temperatures and very dry conditions. The only moisture we really saw was over parts of southern Utah into the Arizona Strip and even near the Colorado border. However, over the last 7 to 10 days, we have seen storms move through the Great Basin at a more increased rate, so it has dropped temperatures. We saw cooler temperatures over the last week with precipitation, especially across Idaho into eastern Nevada and Utah, especially in the higher elevations. Still, some drier areas remain are the far southern and western areas of Nevada into the Sierra and also parts of western Wyoming. Since the beginning of the water year, October 1st, this takes into the entire month of October for 2022, obviously, showing again any moisture has been confined to southern areas of the Great Basin into eastern Utah, and the moisture we have seen over the last 7 to 10 days at least brought an increase in precipitation across the Great Basin, but most areas still largely below normal just because of how dry conditions were the first half of October. Currently, our snowpack is above normal across much of the Great Basin. You can still see a few dots below normal, very little snow in the Sierra. However, basin-wide, as you go further east, we do have above normal snowpack for Idaho into Utah in the higher elevations, and we are closer to normal or just below normal for western Wyoming. 10-hour fuel moisture has been low with the dry conditions we've seen just over the last several days across Nevada into Utah and the Arizona Strip, with obviously the driest conditions further south in Nevada. Further north, we are seeing better fuel moistures with storms and cooler temperatures more readily affecting Idaho into western Wyoming. 100-hour fuel moisture, again, very similar trend, driest down south and in western areas of the basin, and similarly in 1,000-hour fuel moistures as well. However, none of our fuels are critical, and the grasses are in the transition into dormancy. Looking at our fine fuels, again, we still had an above normal fine fuel crop this last fire season for parts of the Snake River Plain in Idaho, and also very small parts of far northwest Nevada. For the most part, the fine fuel crop in the rest of the Great Basin was generally below normal. Did have some local areas that saw a little bit more fuel continuity, but generally on the shorter side for grasses, but really the area with the above normal fine fuel load this year was in Idaho. And again, as these grasses transition to dormancy, they will be on the dry side. So depending on the storm cycle, if we do have prolonged dry periods and then we see an increase in winds and we see an ignition, you could see a fire grow for a burning period in those conditions before the next storm moves in. But again, that would be fairly isolated events, and generally if we have starts in some of these drier areas that have continuous grasses. Otherwise, we do expect the storm track to bring good amounts of precipitation to the northern areas of the Great Basin. Currently, our soil moisture is near or just below normal. And our drought outlook really hasn't changed a whole lot. Our drought monitor shows generally severe to extreme drought over much of the Great Basin. The only exception is parts of central and eastern Idaho that are only in the moderate drought category. Otherwise, we are expecting the drought conditions to persist across Nevada and Utah and into northern Arizona, and we're likely to see more improvements across much of Idaho into western Wyoming, again, as we see the storm track continue to increase and bring storms especially to northern areas going through the next few months. So putting everything together, we'll still first look at our La Nina and El Nino conditions. We have been in either a state of neutral or La Nina for some time, and we are expecting to remain in a La Nina here coming forward for the winter months before we start to see a more significant warm-up going into the spring and summer months, possibly pushing us back up into neutral. Most of the models really agree on this warming trend going into 2023 and into the next fire season, taking us out of this now multiple year La Nina event. But what La Nina means for the Great Basin for the winter is generally this pattern where we see the jet stream dive south into the Pacific Northwest and into the northern Rockies and then down into the Ohio Valley. So that typically brings cooler and wetter conditions to the Pacific Northwest into Idaho and Wyoming, and generally drier conditions for southern areas of the Great Basin. So again, that mainly northern storm track affecting the northern half to third of the Great Basin is what we're expecting again this winter. So for the next 8 to 14 days, taking us from November 8th through the 14th, the storm track is definitely shifting. We are going to see a more active storm track going into the early parts of November. So we do expect cooler and wetter conditions for much of the Great Basin. Even southern areas could see some moisture, but the heavier precipitation likely located over the northern half of the Great Basin. Over the next 4 months, this is the outlook from Predictive Services. So you can see that moisture increasing in November for at least the northern half of the Great Basin, and really continuing in some of the same areas going through the next 4 months with that La Nina in place. And we will continue to see those storm effects from La Nina targeting generally the northern tier of the country, keeping warmer and drier conditions down south. So putting everything together, we are just expecting normal fire potential across the Great Basin, which is generally low fire potential for this time of year from November going through February. The only exceptions, again, will be if we do see that prolonged dry period at any point during the winter season, and we see ignitions in areas of Idaho or northern Nevada that have the above normal fine fuel loading. We could see some growth for a burning period or so on windy days before the moisture kicks back in. But again, we're not expecting a significant problem for that because we are expecting the storm track to bring enough moisture periodically to keep that fire potential on the low side. That concludes our seasonal outlook for this month. Check back at the beginning of December for our next update.